The photographer hadn't even lowered his camera when she hissed it through her teeth like venom on a silver spoon. Couldn't afford something better? Her tone had that sugary burn she reserved for when there were witnesses nearby. Smiles on the outside, rot behind the gums. She didn't wait for my answer. She never really cared for them anyway. Her fingers adjusted the diamond necklace that wasn't hers. Just borrowed from a friend of a friend for the photos. That's all Michelle ever cared about. Impressions, not people. It was her sister's wedding, and everything screamed curated perfection. The imported desert roses flown in from California. The champagne that cost more per bottle than my union dues for 3 months. And that miserable string quartet plucking away at yet another sterile piece as if it meant something to anyone. Everyone dressed like they were auditioning for a country club documentary. And there I was, in a simple navy blue suit I'd had tailored back when I finished my first big commercial job 18 years ago. You'd think I'd be embarrassed. That was the point of her comment, after all, to slice me down to the right size in front of her high-end family. But I didn't flinch. I didn't smirk. I didn't even look at her. That was part of the game. Don't give her the satisfaction. And if you're still listening right now, take 2 seconds and subscribe. 90% of you never do, and it keeps the team going behind the scenes. All right, back to the wedding. I wasn't standing there for her. I wasn't standing there for her family either. I was there because she'd insisted, said it would look weird if I skipped another one of her family's events. Her words, not mine. Weird, as if she was ever worried about appearances until it meant she might be embarrassed by association. I kept my hands in my pockets, drifting toward the back corner of the ballroom, content to become wallpaper. That's when the groom's father saw it. Not my face, not my tie, my wrist. More specifically, the watch. His eyes narrowed, his jaw stopped chewing. He squinted and stepped forward like he was looking at a museum artifact he hadn't expected to find in a back alley pawn shop. He leaned in slightly, confirming something, and then like someone had thrown cold water down the back of his neck, he went pale. He grabbed his son by the elbow mid-conversation, dragging him away from a chat with the officiant. Michelle didn't notice. She was busy air-kissing some cousin in a rented dress. I didn't need to hear the whole conversation. Just the first line, muttered in a harsh whisper that still cut through the background music. "That's a vintage submariner. Do you know who he is?" That's when the murmur started. See, here's the thing about symbols. Most people treat them like decoration. But in certain circles, very, very specific ones, they're signals. That watch, not for sale anymore, not even cataloged in most collections. It was a bespoke gift given. Under very discrete conditions, after I prevented what could have been the worst industrial disaster in Texas history. And only a few people on Earth knew what it meant. One of them apparently was the groom's father, Kenneth Walsh. I didn't react, just stood still with a glass of water in hand, nodding politely to no one. Let the storm begin. The irony was delicious. Michelle thought I wore that old suit because I had nothing better. Thought it made her look better by comparison. She never noticed the watch, never cared to. Thought it was something I picked up at a pawn shop after a good week's pay. She was wrong. And not just about the watch, about everything. Because in her mind, she'd married a simple man, a predictable man, a man who would always be quietly, unremarkably beneath her. A blue-collar guy who fixed other people's electrical problems for $65,000 a year. She had no idea about the emergency calls, the ones that came at 2 a.m. when refineries had catastrophic failures and needed someone who could think fast under pressure. The side work that brought in another $55,000 annually, cash jobs for executives who valued discretion over paperwork. She assumed I made what the union scale suggested and never bothered to look deeper. But now, one whisper, one twitch in Kenneth's face, and suddenly, I wasn't in the background anymore, and she hadn't even noticed. Not yet. Weddings are noisy things. Clinking glasses, forced laughter, over-rehearsed speeches, and a whole lot of smiling through gritted teeth. But beneath that, there's a different kind of sound. The rustle of whispered names, the tilt of heads, the shifting of power without a single word spoken aloud. I caught the first tremor during the vows. 2 bridesmaids side by side, their matching updos rigid enough to survive a desert windstorm, leaned toward each other. One whispered something behind a manicured hand. The other's eyes widened and she turned, subtly toward me. Then a groomsman, halfway through an expensive joke, paused mid-punchline. His gaze landed on me for a second too long. He quickly looked away, the punchline evaporating in his throat. He pulled out his phone under the table, thumb moving fast. I didn't shift, didn't adjust my tie or check my sleeves. I just let them watch, let them guess, let them wonder. Michelle, meanwhile, stood in the center of the reception like a chandelier, bright, decorative, and just unstable enough to make people cautious. She glided from guest to guest, compliments trailing behind her like perfume. "You look stunning tonight. That dress is to die for. Stephanie's lucky to have you here." She was glowing, but she hadn't noticed the dimming around her because the glow wasn't hers anymore. I watched from the terrace, an outsider with a view. The evening breeze tugged gently at the linen tablecloths. I sipped water, ignoring the flutes of champagne being passed around. Never. Touch the distractions when something important is unfolding. Across the room, Kenneth was no longer working the crowd. His wine sat untouched on a tray. He stood near a marble pillar, head bent, phone pressed to his ear. Not a social call, not from that posture. His eyes flicked to me again, and he turned his back to the room. That's when I caught another one. The bride's uncle, Michelle's side, senior partner at a private equity firm whose name you'd only know if you had 7 digits in your monthly expense account. He was halfway through slicing his steak when he spotted me. His fork stopped midair, his brow furrowed. You could practically see the filing cabinet in his head spinning, trying to place me. That's what they were all doing now, trying to remember where they'd seen me. What article, what room, what deal? Michelle used to joke that I was forgettable. "You just blend in," she'd say, like it was charming. She had no idea how much effort it takes to disappear, until you don't. And here's the part she never understood. There are men in this world who dress like shadows on purpose, who keep their heads down, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've already said the things that matter in meetings you'll never be invited to. I caught the eye of a man in a dark gray tuxedo who looked like he was born with oil money. He nodded slightly, barely, and I returned it with the same nothing expression. We'd never spoken, probably never would, but that nod said more than any toast. It said, "I see you," and it said, "I remember." Because some men forget names, but no one forgets the electrician who saved Houston. Not if you've ever been in a boardroom when real decisions are made. Not if you know the price, not the cost, but the price of silence. I turned back to look at Michelle, still chatting near the cake display, basking in attention that was no longer hers. The photographer shifted his lens. Not to her, to me. The flash popped. She didn't even notice, but the temperature in the room had dropped 5 degrees, and the spotlight had moved. The lounge had low lighting, deep leather chairs, and the smell of cigars no one had the courage to light inside yet. It was a room built for power, not comfort. The kind of place men slipped into when the real deals started, away from the bouquet toss and champagne fountains. I stood near the far window, looking out over the desert lights and trying not to laugh because by now I'd seen the glances, felt the shift. My watch had done its job, silent, subtle, and far more disruptive than any outburst could have been. And then came the voice, low, controlled, just behind my right shoulder. "Danny Rodriguez, is it really you?" I turned. The man in front of me was older now, hair grayer, but the posture hadn't changed. Patrick O'Connor, CEO of Gulf States Energy. Back in 2016, we shared an elevator in Houston for all of 40 seconds. And 4 months later, his refinery avoided a catastrophic explosion that would have leveled half the industrial district because of an anonymous tip about faulty wiring in the main control room. I never signed a report, never needed to. Next to him was Kenneth Walsh himself, looking like he'd seen a ghost, but couldn't decide if that was good or bad. They both looked like they'd discovered buried treasure in their backyard. I gave them a nod and sipped my drink, something they both took as confirmation. "You've been off the radar since the Houston incident," Patrick said. "We thought you disappeared." "I did," I replied simply. A beat passed. Kenneth glanced toward the main hall where the string quartet was now sawing their way through some desperate rendition of a pop song. He raised an eyebrow. "You're here with the bridal party?" "My wife's sister," I said. That got them both blinking. Patrick's eyes darted toward the open lounge doors where Michelle had just sauntered past without a glance in our direction, clutching a flute of champagne and laughing too loudly at something the DJ said. "She doesn't know," Kenneth asked. I shrugged. We all have our secrets. Patrick chuckled under his breath. You once told our safety team they had 5 hours before that relay panel would blow. You did it with a screwdriver and a smile. Now you're just... He gestured vaguely toward my suit. Simple, I said. No such thing with you. Another man entered the room. I didn't recognize him, but he recognized me. He stopped walking, paused, then turned back and exited without a word. Kenneth leaned closer, his voice low. Does she even know who she married? I looked out the window again, letting the silence do the talking, because the truth is, she never asked. Not once. She never cared about what I used to do. Never wondered about the occasional late-night emergency calls. Never questioned why I kept a separate phone, or why I had contacts in my phone with titles like refinery, emergency, and pipeline safety. To her, I was a union electrician with decent benefits and a job she could never quite explain to her real estate friends without feeling embarrassed. That was fine. I preferred it that way. But now the name was back in the room, the one I used to hear behind boardroom doors, whispered by people who knew not to say it too loud. I never chased headlines. I prevented the ones that would have made families cry. Then I stepped back into the shadows. Houston was supposed to be the last. One final crisis averted. After that, I walked away from the high-stakes emergency work. And then I met Michelle. She liked me because I was quiet, predictable, safe. But I wasn't any of those things. And tonight, the mask she loved was beginning to slip, one breath at a time. Behind me, Patrick pulled out a card and offered it. If you ever want to resurface... I didn't take it. I didn't need to. He'd find me if he really wanted to. They all would. As the doors swung again, Michelle walked past, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She didn't even glance our way. Didn't notice that the men she spent her whole life wanting to impress were now standing around me. And I, quiet, forgotten, ordinary me, was the reason they were whispering again. She used to call me boring. She had no idea. The clinking of glass brought the room to a slow, expectant silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to command attention without begging for it. Brad Walsh stood, flushed and jittery, holding his champagne awkwardly. Before I say anything, he began, voice shaky but rehearsed, my father asked to say a few words. Apparently, something came up. He stepped aside, and Kenneth rose smoothly, calmly, like this wasn't his first time at a microphone, because it wasn't. He was the kind of man who gave speeches that moved markets. He'd buried competitors with a single pause. But this time, the intensity in his voice was different. This wasn't, business. This was reverence. Today is about family, he said, voice echoing in the vaulted hall. And some families are lucky to marry into extraordinary people. People chuckled politely, expecting a harmless anecdote about in-laws and new beginnings. Then he turned his body slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at me. I was still at my table, hands folded, not moving, not blinking. I once had the honor, he continued, of watching this man. He raised his hand and pointed, prevent what could have been the worst industrial disaster in Texas history. A process I thought impossible until I saw it done with nothing but expertise, courage, and a commitment to protecting lives. A chair scraped faintly across the floor somewhere. A fork clinked against a plate, but otherwise, silence. I didn't know he was here today, Kenneth said, but I'm grateful he is. He didn't mention my name. He didn't need to. I saw the ripple hit the head table first. Michelle was mid-sip. Her hand froze. Her eyes narrowed, not in confusion. No, not yet. It was more primal, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she didn't know everything after all. Her gaze turned. She looked at me, and I didn't flinch. For the first time that evening, her expression dropped its polish. She wasn't smiling now. She wasn't smug. She looked stiff, like a mannequin someone forgot to dust off. Her eyes darted back toward Kenneth as if searching for some kind of clarification, some way to reinterpret what she just heard. But the room had already shifted. At other tables, people were glancing over, women whispering behind clutched napkins, men checking their phones not to leave, but to timestamp the moment. Even the photographer, who had spent the past hours circling the bride like a hawk over glittering prey, was now moving toward me. I didn't rise, didn't wave, didn't do a damn thing. I just sat there, let it sink in, let her feel it. You have to understand something about Michelle. She worshipped status, appearances. Her entire personality was built on being adjacent to importance, not important herself. She was never wired for that, but near it, close enough to feel the warmth without ever starting the fire. That's why she married me, because I didn't glow too brightly, because I didn't compete. And tonight, her little illusion cracked wide open in front of 300 people, a quarter of whom were high enough up the ladder to matter. I saw her glance at her sister Stephanie, pure confusion, then at her mother, whose mouth was tight, and finally back to me. I raised my glass, not high, just enough for her to see. No smile, no nod, just acknowledgement. Kenneth finished his toast, thanked the room, and sat down like nothing earth-shattering had occurred. But it had, and she knew it, because the man she mocked for wearing a suit from nearly 2 decades ago was now the center of gravity. Not her, not the bride, not even the money propping up this over-decorated circus. The room didn't applaud loudly. They didn't need to. The silence was the applause. She looked at me again, eyes pleading for something, an explanation, maybe a denial, a crack in the story she could slip through and control the narrative. But I gave her nothing, because that's the thing about ghosts. We don't make noise. We make impact. Her fingers locked around my arm the second I set my glass down. Hard, not affectionate, possessive. "What is going on?" she hissed through her teeth, her smile frozen for the sake of the guests still watching from across the room. I turned toward her slowly, met her eyes with the same calm I'd carried all night. "You never asked," I said. She blinked. "What?" "You never asked," I repeated, quieter this time, just for her. She stared at me like I was speaking a different language. And maybe I was, because in her world, things only mattered if they were announced at parties, posted on social media, turned into stories for her client dinners. But I lived in a quieter place, one where words cost something, one where silence had more weight than her entire wardrobe. Behind her, I saw Kenneth glance in our direction, then give me a curt, respectful nod. Not the forced kind reserved for groomsmen or family members. The real kind, the one you give to someone who could make your professional future evaporate with a single phone call and choose not to. The photographers were shifting too, just slightly, their lenses no longer following the bride's train or the curated floral arrangements. They were pointing subtly, professionally, toward the table where I sat. The man in the modest suit, the one no one saw coming, and Michelle. She was finally feeling what it meant to lose a room. She looked around again, her eyes scanning faces like a social stock ticker, and what she saw must have terrified her. The smiles were thinner now, the conversations quieter. A few guests she'd spent the last year desperately trying to impress were whispering not to her, but about her, and all of it traced back to me. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, voice trembling, mascara fighting gravity. "I was never hiding," I said, stepping out of her grip. That part was true. I never lied to her. I told her I worked in electrical. I told her I used to do emergency work. I told her I left the high-pressure jobs behind years ago. She just didn't care to ask what kind of emergencies or who called me, because she assumed in her dismissive little hierarchy that if I didn't flaunt it, it wasn't real. She preferred surface shine, status that could be photographed, name-dropped, turned into stories for her little dinner parties, with women who sold houses to doctors and told themselves they'd made it. She wanted to be the center of every room, and now she was something else. A side note, an afterthought, an accessory to the man she spent years subtly minimizing. I stepped away from the table. She didn't follow. I made my way to the bar, nodding politely at a couple of men I recognized, power brokers who hadn't spoken my name in public for years. One of them raised his glass. I raised mine back. Michelle was still standing there alone, unsure of whether to sit back down or pretend she had somewhere important to be. That's the moment the mask slipped, not in a dramatic way. No screaming, no slaps, no scene, just stillness. She stood frozen in her designer heels, wrapped in her own illusion, realizing the scaffolding she'd built carefully, ruthlessly, over years, was made of matchsticks, and the flame had already started. They caught me by the terrace, away from the noise, where the air was cooler and the music couldn't reach. 2 of her relatives, cousins or nephews, or some other distant title she used like furniture, useful only when it matched the room. Both men in their early 30s, awkward in their expensive suits, the kind who wore cologne, like confidence and spoke too fast when nervous. "Hey," one said, eyes shifting to make sure we were alone. "We just wanted to say, no offense, but we didn't know." I tilted my head slightly. "Didn't know what?" The other cleared his throat. "What you really do? Who you are." "Oh," I said nothing. Let them twist in it a bit. People always rush to fill silence with their own guilt. The first one stepped in closer. "Just so you know, she's been telling people you were on reduced hours, that you couldn't work full-time anymore." My brow raised slightly. "Really?" He nodded, apologetic. "Yeah, like you were, early retirement for health reasons. She made it sound like you were kind of done, barely getting by on disability." The second one added, "She even joked once, said she was the breadwinner, that she let you feel useful by doing yard work." I looked past them, over the garden lights where Michelle now sat alone at a table, scrolling through her phone like it owed her an explanation. I smiled, small, tight. "Thank you." They shifted uncomfortably. "We just thought you should know." But I did know. I'd always known. It wasn't just the comments. It was how she introduced me, if she introduced me at all. "Oh, this is my husband. He's retired." She always dropped the word like a glass on tile. Final, fragile. She'd crafted that story over time. A man who had once worked, now content to fade into the background, while she hosted parties and signed contracts and collected praise from rooms full of people who didn't know any better. But now they were asking questions, and she was scrambling for answers she didn't have. I looked down at my phone, thought for a moment, then made a call. The man who answered didn't need pleasantries. "Still owe me for Houston," I said. There was a pause. "Name it." I gave him the name of the luxury real estate firm where Michelle had clawed her way onto the preferred agent list. The same firm whose clients were now quietly watching a PR crisis unfold, not about me, but about her. "I want her removed," I said. Not publicly, not dramatically, just removed. He understood. Transferred or vacant? Vacant. He didn't ask why, didn't need to. "I'll make the calls tonight." I hung up. That was it. No rage, no screaming, no revenge fantasy. Just precision because people like her didn't fall from one blow. They dimmed, faded, lost wattage until even their own reflection stopped recognizing them. I returned to the reception. The music had picked up again, but the dancing was slower now, more cautious. Michelle sat with her shoulders pulled in, posture crumbling inward like a collapsed tent. A woman approached her, one of the older board donors she used to parade around like a personal endorsement. They spoke briefly, and then the woman walked away. Didn't hug her, didn't smile, just left. Michelle looked down at her lap, unmoving. The first crack in her face wasn't from emotion. It was from realization, the kind that comes too late. Because she had spent years pruning her image, trimming her life down to something polished and enviable. But in doing so, she had clipped the only roots that mattered, trust. And once that's gone, you don't burn. You just fade. The drive home was silent. Michelle stared out the passenger window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. She kept checking her phone, scrolling through messages that weren't coming, likes that had stopped flowing. By the time we pulled into our driveway, she had that hollow look people get when they realize they've been living in a house of cards during earthquake season. "Danny," she said quietly as I turned off the engine, "how much do we really make?" I looked at her for the first time in hours. "We? Together? I mean, what's our actual household income?" "About 120, I said. Her mouth opened slightly. She'd been telling people she was the primary earner at 80 grand while I scraped by, on union wages. The math didn't work anymore, and she knew it. "You never asked," I said again, getting out of the car. But this time, she heard it differently. This time, it sounded like what it was, an epitaph. The aftermath was swift and surgical. By Monday morning, her luxury property listings had mysteriously been reassigned to other agents. Tuesday brought a polite but firm letter from the country club about membership review processes and waiting lists. Her interior design referrals, the ones that had been her pride and side income, dried up by Wednesday. And then came the social media storm. Someone had posted that photo from the wedding, the one of me at the table while Kenneth spoke. The caption was simple: "The electrician who saved Houston." It went viral in circles that mattered. Trade publications picked it up. LinkedIn connections I'd forgotten about started reaching out. Michelle tried to control the narrative, posting her own version of events, but the internet had already decided she wasn't the star of this story. She was the woman who didn't know her own husband, the woman who mocked a man who prevented industrial catastrophe, the woman who built her identity on knowing everyone who mattered, but missed the one who mattered most. I never had to lift another finger. The truth did the work for me. Within a month, she'd moved back in with her sister Stephanie. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, which was technically accurate. We'd always been different. She just hadn't bothered to notice until it was too late. The house felt bigger without her, quieter but not empty. I kept the same routines, the same schedule, the same modest lifestyle that had driven her to distraction. The only difference was the phone calls. They started coming again. Not often, but regularly. Men with measured voices and complicated problems who needed someone who understood that the most important work happens in the shadows. Patrick O'Connor called first. Something about a pipeline integrity issue in West Texas. Kenneth Walsh followed a week later. A chemical plant in Louisiana with some concerning electrical anomalies. I took both jobs. Not because I needed the money, but because some habits die hard. And because, despite what Michelle thought, I was never really retired. Just selective. The watch still sits on my wrist. The suit still hangs in my closet, pressed and ready. And sometimes, when I'm working late on a complex electrical problem that could save lives or prevent disasters, I think about that night at the wedding. About the look on her face when she realized she'd been married to a stranger. Not because I'd hidden who I was, but because she'd never cared enough to look. She wanted to shine in rooms full of people who didn't matter. I chose to work in the dark, fixing problems for people who did. She built her world on appearances, on borrowed jewelry and rented status. I built mine on competence, on the quiet satisfaction of preventing catastrophes no one would ever read about in the morning news. In the end, that's the difference between us. She needed an audience to feel important. I just needed to be useful. She craved recognition from strangers. I earned respect from people who actually understood what it cost. She mocked my simple suit because she confused expensive with valuable. But some things can't be bought at any price. Integrity, competence, and the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. The truth is, power isn't about what you wear, or where you're seen, or how loudly you can demand attention. Real power is about what you can do when everything else fails. Who you know will answer when you call, and whether you sleep well, knowing that your work makes the world a little safer for people who will never know your name. She thought she'd married beneath her station. Turns out she'd married someone whose station was so far above hers, she couldn't even see it from where she stood. And when you spend your life looking down on others, you miss the view that actually matters, the one looking back at you, measuring your worth not by what you have, but by what you've done when no one was watching. That's the lesson she'll never learn. But then again, she never really wanted to. Some people are content being shadows of substance. Others choose to become the substance that casts the shadow.